Well, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this conference. And I see many familiar faces around the room here, people I've known and worked with for a number of years. Some of them actually with Texas connections, many, of course, from Tokyo. And those of you who know me, and my name is Jim Hollifield, and I'm the director of the Tower Center, and I have a professorship in international political economy at SMU, and have worked quite a bit on Japan myself, but much more in Europe, as my colleague Kunesue-san can attest. And I think if someone had told me 30 years ago I would be in Texas running a center with a very large program on Japan, I think I would have said, no, not going to be possible. But it is fortuitous for me because my wife of 45 years is from Tokyo. So I have been coming here a lot over the years. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to come with me on this trip. But let me just say that we really are thrilled to be back at KEIO. I know we have some of our longtime collaborators here. This is such a beautiful place, a beautiful campus. And of course, my colleague Takeuchi Sensei is a graduate of KEIO University, as is my wife, by the way. One of the things she's very, very proud of is a graduate of KEIO. And I just want to reinforce, since we have both Ambassador Schieffer here, Ambassador Kirk, who arrived in the back. This might be a little bit dangerous territory, diplomatically speaking, but this meeting might be as much about Texas and Japan as it is about the United States and Japan, because we know that Japan has an enormous presence, economically speaking, in Texas, and the ties between Texas and Japan, especially Dallas and North Texas, just keep growing constantly. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that not only am I representing the Tower Center here, but somewhere my colleague Jennifer Aperti, I hope you will meet her. We have a center at SMU that's focused on Texas and Mexico, and one of the sponsors of this event. So I guess we're having a sort of trilateral meeting here, discussion between Texas, Japan, and Mexico. And this is an incredibly important relationship. So I think I will stop there and look forward to hearing from everyone over the next day or so. Tomorrow, I hope you will all be back for the conference, full day conference. And now my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Takeuchi Sensei. I always say I've hired dozens of people in my life and career, but I had one extraordinarily good hire, and that is Takeuchi, who came to us from UCLA. And he's been a professor at SMU now for what, 13 years, 14 years, 15 years. So it seems like only yesterday. So we have had so many great programs over the years, and I'm sure this one is going to be another great program, and we'll have a fantastic scholarly exchange, intellectual exchange, political exchange, economic exchange, maybe even do some business while we're here. So let me now please join me in welcoming Takeuchi Sensei.
Good evening. Thank you for coming for this incremental weather. In Japanese, like 足元の悪い中、ようこそいらっしゃいました。どうもありがとうございます。My name is Hiroki Takeuchi. The symposium, hosting this symposium is quite a little bit make me emotional. We were planning to come back to KEIO to host the symposium together with the KGRI in 2020. And then at that time, we were planning a symposium with the late Dr. Toshihiro Nakayama, and a very good friend of mine, a great colleague. And then he passed away suddenly in May 2022. And then, so Dr. Nakayama visited Dallas so many times. And I don't know how many times that he visited. And then he always talks about it's very important to understand American domestic politics, to think about US-Japan relations, and to analyze American domestic politics, you have to come to Texas. He always said that. And then, in this year, finally, when border restrictions of Japan was lifted, we tried to we started organizing the symposium. So I'm very glad to be back to KEIO. But this symposium was not possible without the first help from the SMU Tower Center side. So I'd like to acknowledge our executive director, Jenny Appelti. Also, program director, Astrid Galvin, who is, oh yeah. Also, we have two students, and now actually former students, because they just graduated this May, Savani Desai and Kiri McNamee, but they are actually just not the former students. So, they have already published an article in the peer-reviewed journal. And then those who are not in academia may not know how difficult and how rare it is. So please join me for acknowledging who I usually call my powerhouses. Savani Desai and Kiri McNamee. And if you are interested in those articles on page 10 of the program, you see the QR codes, and then if you scan it, and then you can read you can read those articles. And then we are so glad to co-sponsor this event with KEIO University Global Research Institute. So director of the KGRI, my now old friend, Dr. Motohiro Tsuchiya. Also, today he's not here, but he will join us tomorrow as a panelist, Dr. Satoru Mori. He actually organized almost everything with a in a very meticulous way. So I knew that, and he was a great starter, but I didn't know that he was such a great administrator. And then also Dr. Yuichi Hosoya. And this program symposium is co-sponsored and then assisted by two institutes. One is our airfare is greatly supported by Japan Airlines. Today we have a representative from Japan Airlines, currently the head of the Matsuyama office of Japan Airlines, former head of Dallas office of Japan Airlines, Mr. Hiroshi Abe. Also representing the Japan Foundation, my now like a old friend, long-time friend, Ayumi Takita. Thank you very much for the support. And then also the board member of the Japan Foundation, Dr. Yuri Sato. Thank you very much, the support of the Japan Foundation. So, and then also one more person I would like to acknowledge, former speaker of Sun Star Symposium in Japan, the speaker of, one of the speakers of the 2018 Sun Star Symposium in Japan, which took place in the Kansei Gakuin University, Mr. Norito Kunisue of Asahi Shimbun. So today, I'm really delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Ambassador Tom Schieffer. it's very difficult to think about better person to kick off this discussion of the U.S.-Japan relations of the post-pandemic period, which is filled with uncertainty. Ambassador Schieffer has been in Texas for his whole life. He often visits my class, and then I usually introduce him to my students in a way that actually he has done everything that my students usually say they want to do. So some students say they want to be a lawyer. Some students say they want to be a politician. Some students say they want to do business. Some students say they want to be involved in the international affairs, foreign policy making. Ambassador Schieffer has done all of them. He started his career as a Texas legislator, and then later he practiced law. Also, interestingly, probably it's not written in the official bio, but very interesting and important for me, he was president of the Texas Rangers baseball team in the 1990s when the Rangers went to the playoff for the first time, and then Rangers went to playoff 3 times during his tenure as president of Texas Rangers. And then later in 2001, President George W. Bush, his longtime friend, appointed him to be U.S. ambassador to Australia. And then later in 2005, when President Bush was re-elected, he was appointed to ambassador to Japan. When I came to Dallas in 2008, I, of course, knew of Ambassador Schieffer. And if I had an opportunity to meet him, that would be wonderful. And then, well, when I met him for the first time, it was kind of dreams come true. So I'm so glad to introduce Ambassador Schieffer. So please join me for welcoming Ambassador Schieffer, who is also a Hall of Famer of the Texas Rangers baseball team.
Well, thank you, Takeuchi. Sensei, it's always a pleasure to be with you. I've enjoyed our association over the years, and I always enjoy coming to your classes because there's nothing that I think it is more fulfilling than to talk to young people who want to make a difference in the world. And they certainly come to your classes often. I also have to say, when the mention of the Texas legislature, I think of my friend, Ambassador Ron Kirk. And we first met when I was a very young member of the Texas legislature, and he was working in an office of Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson, who had been elected with me. And she just recently retired from the Congress, and she was in the Congress for 30 or 40 years, and really an influential member of the Congress and a very fine representative from Texas. And so that's where I started knowing Ambassador Kirk, was that association. And we actually took the bar. I didn't go to law school until a little later than he did. And we actually took the bar on the same day and sweated out the results. And we both became lawyers as a result of it. And that was a real great relief. I'm so glad to be here today to once again celebrate the 2023 Sun and Star Symposium, U.S.-Japan relations in the post-pandemic world. It feels so good for all of us to be together again, to be in the same room again, to enjoy the fellowship of friends, talking about how to strengthen the ties between the United States and Japan. At the same time, the challenges we faced over the last few years remind us that heartache and worry can never be far away. Recalling those occurrences can leave us sad and even despondent. For now, though, it seems as if we are finally emerging from the worst pandemic in more than 100 years. a pandemic that has disrupted the world economy and cost the lives of almost 75,000 Japanese and an astonishing 1,165,000 Americans. The brutal assaults, the brutal results of the carnage in Ukraine remind us that wars of aggression are still possible in the 21st century, just as they were prevalent in the 20th. Since the outbreak of that war, it can be credibly argued that the United States and Russia have been closer to a nuclear exchange than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Pandemics and wars are not the only difficult things we have been dealing with in recent years. Climate change manifests itself almost daily as every typhoon, hurricane, tornado, wildfire, drought, flood, snowstorm, ice storm, and windstorm seem worse than the last. More and more violence seems to grip our world, whether it is occurring on the streets and in the schools of America or the campaign trail in Japan. The churches, synagogues, and mosques of the world, or the civil wars of Africa and the Middle East, it is making all of us feel more vulnerable. Evidence of continued racial and religious discrimination in the United States haunted Americans throughout the pandemic and even down to this day. Whether it has been the color of our skins, the tenets of our religions, or the justice of our causes, we ask ourselves more than once over the last few years if the march of humanity was advancing or retreating. Wealth inequality accelerated during the pandemic, with more of our citizens, particularly those in rural areas of the United States and Japan, feeling left behind in places with less access to the digital world, shrinking job opportunities, and out-of-date work skills. After the Berlin Wall came down on the night of November 9th, 1989, and the Soviet Union collapsed on Christmas Day in 1991, democracy began to bloom all over Europe. Germany was reunited for the first time since 1945. Nations of the former Soviet Eastern Bloc had largely peaceful revolutions that installed democratic governments in their wake. Democracy appeared to be in the ascendancy all over the world. By the time of the pandemic, authoritarians, as is often the case in difficult times, began to argue that democracy could no longer deliver when it came to governing. It seemed as if toxins of another virus, extremism, polarization, violence, were infecting the body politic of countries around the world. Along with the millions of others, Americans watched in horror as hooligans bent on destruction stormed our nation's capital to prevent the peaceful transfer of power from one administration to another. Nothing like that had ever occurred in the 245 years of American independence. It was disheartening to most Americans and Japanese, as well as other global citizens. Things like that might happen in other countries of the world, but they weren't supposed to happen in America. But they did. So what are we to make of U.S.-Japan relations today in the wake of such a post-pandemic world? Simply put, they are as strong as they have ever been and portend an even closer working relationship in the years to come. What causes me to have confidence in that assertion? Let me return to the war in Ukraine for evidence. When Russian troops crossed the Ukraine border on February 24th, 2022, I think it would be fair to say that Vladimir Putin expected to be in the capital of Kyiv within weeks, installing a puppet government that would do his bidding. As we now know, he found an enraged people defending their freedom, led by a courageous leader, the likes of which invited favorable comparisons to Winston Churchill. We may have been surprised, but I don't think Ukrainians were. They did not want to be a part of Putin's reconstituted Russian Empire, and they were willing to lay down their lives to prevent it. Putin discovered something the French learned in the 18th century. They called it rage militaire, a term they used to define the difference between hired mercenaries who fight without cause for pay and soldiers who fight without pay for a cause. When the fighting starts, the mercenaries wonder why they are risking their lives. The soldiers see the cause in the faces of their children and loved ones. One is ready to quit early. The other never wants to quit until their enemies are all gone. There were a lot of other things that Putin and all of us learned from the Ukrainian war. The Russian military wasn't as good as we thought it was. When you begin a war with a Russian tank column that is 50 miles long, penetrating deep into Ukrainian territory, and it runs out of gas on the second or third day of operations, you either don't know what you were doing or you ignored the advice of those who did. Despite what you might see in war movies, logistics determine the winners and losers on the battlefield. In the American military, there are about 9 people behind every one warfighter. Something went terribly wrong for the Russians when enough gasoline couldn't be delivered to keep those tanks engaged in the fight, and they suffered the consequences. Corruption inside the Red Army has been known for decades, but it manifested itself early in this war. Think for a moment of what corruption can do to something like aircraft maintenance. Most commanders would want their airplanes maintained to at least an 85% of operating capacity. Put another way, if you had 100 airplanes, you would want at least 85 of them to be able to be ready to fly in combat with weapons on any given day. But only 35 of them were ready to fly. But what if you paid for maintenance for 100 airplanes, but only 35 of them were ready to fly? And not all of them could be fully weaponized because somebody in charge of maintenance and weapons acquisition was on the take. That would be a problem, and you might not discover its depth until you engaged in real world warfare. I think that's what happened to the Russians. After all, the people who were taking bribes from those who are being paid to do the maintenance but aren't will not be the ones who will blow the whistle on the wrongdoers. Corruption can hollow out the effectiveness of any military in the world, and it has been a big part of Putin's failures in Ukraine. There is no doubt that Vladimir Putin did not believe that Ukraine was a real country. He told several world leaders that over many years. There is also no doubt that he dreamed of reconstituting a Russian empire once again and saw NATO as an obstacle to that end. Excuse me. While it is only speculation on my part, Putin had to have believed that much of NATO, particularly Germany, could be neutralized on his aggressive behavior because of its dependency on Russian natural gas to meet its energy needs. But confronted with the choice of another aggressor running wild on the European continent and the possibility of a harsh winter, NATO, Germany, and even non-NATO Europeans chose to take their chances with a tough winter? Could Putin's habit of blackjacking countries that buy Russian gas but don't want to be held hostage to future Russian demands have long-term consequences? How could it not? Does anyone really think that Germans or Lithuanians would welcome the chance to once again be heavily dependent on Russian natural gas to meet their energy needs? For that matter, would the Poles or the Czechs or the Indians or even Putin's new friends in China want to put their necks in the Russian energy noose? I think not. For a petrostate like Russia that gets the vast majority of its government revenues from the sale of fossil fuels, that could be a severe long-term problem, especially in a world that is rapidly transitioning from coal, oil, and gas to cleaner energies as a result of climate change. Put another way, I believe Putin has spooked potential customers in what will be a shrinking market over the next few decades. Not exactly a great example of marketing genius. While Putin clearly wanted to demonstrate NATO's inability to keep the peace in Europe, his actions have only served to strengthen it. Switzerland, a neutral in both World War I and II, joined NATO, as did Finland, with more than an 800-mile common border with Russia. So too will Sweden once its problems with Turkey are laid to rest, and I think that will happen sometime soon. Though it does not seek membership, Prime Minister Kishida visited NATO headquarters in Belgium, the first Japanese prime minister to do that. NATO is now expected to open an office in Tokyo to further cooperation between it and Japan. How could any of that be better for Putin or Russia? Vladimir Putin in 2005 called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It would be ironic if Putin's words came back to haunt him, should historians come to the conclusion in future years that his war in Ukraine was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 21st century. Let us turn now to the situation that presents itself in China. Xi Jinping is the closest thing to a real communist leader that we have seen since Mao. Deng Xiaoping was not. He counseled the ruling Communist Party to open the Chinese economy to more free market forces if it wanted to stay in power. The results of that counsel brought hundreds of millions of Chinese out of abject poverty. Successors to Deng, like Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, essentially followed the same policy, and the Chinese economy grew to be the second largest in the world. While Deng, Jiang, and Hu counseled patience on Taiwan and largely avoided confrontation with the United States over its interests in the Pacific, Xi appears highly impatient with the status quo. His aggressive action to expand China's defense perimeter by creating man-made islands in the Pacific and militarizing them after promising not to do so has increased the tension in the Indo-Pacific. His crackdown on Hong Kong, which basically breached the agreement China had with the United Kingdom to allow self-government in its former colony, was a wake-up call around the world. It made it much harder to believe that China was willing to wait for a peaceful resolution to the Taiwan situation. For the first time in a long time, it felt like a Chinese leader was preparing to move on Taiwan militarily. When Vladimir Putin showed up in Beijing to discuss his upcoming invasion of Ukraine, the substance of his remarks have not been publicly revealed. But it is not hard to imagine a possible narrative. Putin would say, the United States is in decline. Its politics are totally polarized, which will make it impossible for the president to convince a majority of Americans that the national security of the United States is at risk in Ukraine. Russia, Putin might say, might get sanctioned again, like it did when it moved into Georgia. But Russia has nuclear weapons, and that will allow it to survive the sanctions for the invasion of Ukraine, just as it survived the sanctions for the invasion of Georgia. America will be enfeebled. NATO will complain, but be unable to change the outcome in Ukraine. As a result, the United States will be further diminished and its decline accelerated, hastening the day when China could move on Taiwan with impunity. Putin did add one thing that we do know for sure, that Russia would not invade before the Winter Olympics in China concluded, lest the world be distracted from the splendor of emerging Chinese power. There is one more bad boy regime that we should consider before getting back to the effects all this is having on US-Japan relations: North Korea. Kim Jong-un continues to fire missiles and threaten to explode nuclear devices. I was the ambassador to Japan when he fired his first ICBM. It went straight up for about 42 seconds before exploding. Much of the debris came back down on the launch pad. If that missile had stayed up a minute or two longer before arching in over to its flight plan and then failed, it likely would have bellied into Japan. Think that that would have caused any problem? The United States was prepared to meet any of the contingencies of that moment. But what would have happened after? Nobody knows. There were 6 other missiles that were fired by the North Koreans that same day. 3 were short range and could have hit targets in South Korea. 3 were medium range and could have hit targets in Japan. All 6 worked perfectly that day. The only one that failed was the ICBM. North Korea presents a security threat to South Korea, Japan, and the United States every day. Every citizen of the Republic of Korea is either within artillery or missile range of North Korea, every citizen. So too are approximately 28,500 American military personnel. It is the hotspot in the world that never really cools, and the least likely to change anytime soon. So what has been the impact of Ukraine, China, and North Korea on the relationship between the United States and Japan? Everything has become more serious. No longer are we dealing with abstractions. Never has our alliance been more important to the security of both our countries. Never have the United States and Japan worked closer together to preserve the peace of Northeast Asia. Last December, Japan released 3 excellent reports: the National Defense Strategy, the National Security Strategy, and the Defense Build-Up Program. These are serious documents that were obviously given serious thought to describe what Japan is prepared to do to meet the security challenges of today and coming years. It is not an outline for going to war. It is an outline to deter war. At the heart of these reports is the conviction that the United States and Japan together are greater than the sum of their individual parts. That together, a stronger Japan and a stronger America will deter what would-be aggressors from starting a war they could not win. Japan commits itself in these documents to taking a whole-of-government approach to increasing its defense capabilities, whether it is diplomacy, defense, economic security, food security, technology, or cyberspace. Every part of the Japanese government will be involved. Japan commits itself to doubling its defense budget, and that would make it the third largest defense budget in the world. Only the United States and China would be spending more. Japan wants to do more with the United States to ensure that its weapons are interoperable with us and complementary to American forces. That will be a force multiplier for both our countries. Japan is already America's largest contributor to missile defense. That partnership will continue with additional emphasis in the future. Japan wants to increase its technological capability as well as its profile in cyber and unmanned vehicles. Japan wants to collaborate on defense issues with like-minded countries such as Australia, India, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, the Republic of Korea, Canada, New Zealand, and the ASEAN countries. The dream of Abe Shinzo that the four great democracies of the Pacific, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, should get together to increase cooperation among themselves has dawned. Meetings of the Quad have gone from virtual summits during the pandemic to regular face-to-face meetings. The United States and the United Kingdom have agreed to share nuclear submarine technology with Australia. The resulting AUKUS agreement will have a significant impact on the strategic balance in the Pacific. Australia will build 5 nuclear-powered submarines for the Pacific, which will be conventionally armed. The United States will build 9 more nuclear-powered submarines. Not all will be for the Pacific, but all will be capable of launching conventional or nuclear weapons. Japan and Australia are now doing exercises together. The United States is rotating Marines through Australia for training on a regular basis. Japan and South Korea are enjoying perhaps the best relations they have ever had. Cooperation on matters of mutual defense is very good right now between those two countries. Prime Minister Abe's rescue of the TPP after President Trump withdrew the United States from the treaty is bearing fruit after the United Kingdom joined the treaty. Hopefully, the United States will one day soon agree to rejoin the pact as well. On the day that Xi Jinping showed up in Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin, Prime Minister Kishida showed up in Kyiv to meet with President Zelensky. It was not a coincidence. All these activities are a result of Chinese, Russian, and North Korean provocations. People now talk about the Indo-Pacific as the future where the world will be made or broken. I think that's right. But I also think we need to remind ourselves that other generations have faced difficult moments too. Would anyone in this room seriously argue that the problems of 1945 were easier than the problems of 2023? I don't think so. The pandemic and the man-made or natural tragedies may have sapped our emotions, but it is still good to be an American in the world. It is still good to be a Japanese in the world. Great things still need to be done. And Japanese and Americans together are still needed to do them. The future, with all its challenges, is still ours to embrace and to enjoy together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Schieffer. Very, very comprehensive analysis of the current U.S.-Japan relations, and then also how to maintain the international order. So as a moderator, I'd like to ask a first question. And so when I was thinking about the title of this symposium, the first word I thought of was uncertainty. And then, of course, you know, that comes from pandemic, but also one of the sources of the uncertainty is now American domestic politics. And then this is actually very surprising for me, because as I grew up in Japan, and then now I have become an American citizen. US is actually always a kind of model of stability. And then now it seems that the US is kind of like one of the sources of instability. So my question is two things. So one, why is like American domestic politics so divided, and then even like has a negative implications for leading the international order? And secondly, what can we do, you know? And then like especially another surprise, really, like now US is like really like taking Japan as a partner, and then wants Japan to play more role. I think it's very well, it's very challenging, because like I can raise a lot of the issues why Japan will find it difficult to lead the international order. So how do you think about that? So what is the challenge, and what is the hope for the United States to work with Japan to build and lead international order in the post-pandemic world?
Well, let me answer the second question first, and then we'll get back to American politics. I think what is happening in Japan right now is very dramatic. The Japanese are talking about things publicly that they might have talked about privately a few years ago. But I don't think it's just the politicians that are talking about that. I think the Japanese public is recognizing a real threat. And I think that they, in many respects, are leading the politicians to some of the decisions that they're making. And I don't want to, I think Prime Minister Kishida has really stepped out and taken a leading role here, and has accomplished things that I frankly thought might not be accomplished. And he should be congratulated for that. But this is no longer an abstraction. I think people realize that there could be a military confrontation of some kind. And I think that the Ukraine basically was the wake-up call. And I think that Xi Jinping, if there's anything good that has come out of Ukraine, and it's hard to say anything has, but if she looks at what happened to Putin as a result of this war, and how it has weakened the thought that the Russian military was as strong as it is, he'd have to take pause, because a move on Taiwan would be something that would be, I think, 100 times bigger than the situation in Ukraine. And there is a dynamic between Russia and China that is old, and it often presents these kind of challenges. That is, you have an ascending power and a descending power. And that, frankly, was what happened in World War I, in which you had the Germans were an ascending power, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the descending power. And the war started in Sarajevo when the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated. And it followed what was about 10 years of international relations in which people would come to the brink and somebody would blink and no one blinked. And all of a sudden we tumbled into war. I'm talking about the world tumbled into war. And as the war started, the various statesmen involved in it said, how did this happen? How did this event lead to that, to a world war? And it was inexplicable. And it was a great tragedy for humankind. And of course, planted the seeds for the Second World War. But we had to be very careful right now that we don't tumble into war by accident. And I'm talking about everybody. But I think that the Japanese people are in a position that may not have existed in the past. Prime Minister Koizumi and Prime Minister Abe both talked about Japan being a normal nation again. I think Japan is on the cusp of that occurring because the Japanese public wants it to happen. I'm convinced. And that's huge. But there's no question in my mind that Japan and the United States together are a formidable force in the world. And the United States has long been the longest provider of aid in the world. Japan's often the second or third. It has a history of that. Japan works on every front. And yes, it has not been always recognized on a military basis, but the self-defense forces in Japan are very good. They're not second rate by any means. And I think that what the Japanese are talking about in this buildup is again, it's not something to make war, it's something to prevent war. And when you have a disciplined military that has capacity to do things, you're going to keep the peace. And if you have a deteriorating situation, you're going to invite aggression. And we don't want to do that. So I think there's a lot of stuff going on here. I think there's an interaction in the Pacific. The relationship between Japan and Australia is gaining strength every year. The very last thing that I did when I was in Australia, you may recall that there was an engineering, I don't remember whether it was a battalion, but it was Japanese, and the force protection for it was provided by the Dutch. And the Dutch were leaving. And I went to John Howard and said, is it possible that Australia could provide the force protection for the Japanese? And he said it was, and that he would work to make that happen. He took a lot of grief over that, frankly. Veterans groups in Australia were very anti-Japanese, frankly. But they provided the force protection and it was successful. And I watched Australians from afar, because I was up here, I watched Australians take real pride in that they had worked with the Japanese. And to me, the war was finally over. And I think that's happened all over the Pacific, in which Japan, and I think a big thing that happened with Abe Shinzo, when he basically rescued the TPP, there was no criticism on Japan. There was congratulations to Japan for holding it together until the United States came to its senses and joined. And now you've got the UK involved. And that was great statesmanship. Again, it got applause in the rest of Asia, not condemnation. You're not hearing Japan being condemned in Asia for this, talking about increasing their capacity in military matters. That's good. And I think this can be a very exciting time for the U.S.-Japan relationship, and one in which it leads as it as it always should have been thought of as leading the international order to a more peaceful world. Now, American politics. Believe me, if I knew how to get out of this, I would let you know. I think the American people are still a good people. I think my observation is that both in Japan and in Australia, Australians and Japanese and many other places around the world thought that someone like Donald Trump could never be elected in the United States. They thought it might happen somewhere else, but it wasn't going to happen in the United States. Well, it did. And one thing that I would point out to you is that Donald Trump has never won a majority of the vote in any election. He's always won. He won the electoral college vote, but he lost the popular vote by 3 million. He lost in the second time after he'd been elected president, he lost the popular vote by 7 million. And the percentages were worse. I don't think the American people want to elect President Trump again. Now, that's my opinion, but I think Japanese and Australians worry about it more than I do. And I can see why they would. But I think that's the situation. But the American people have a certain goodness to them and a certain conscience to them that has served them well over the years. We began this, the American democracy, white men with that owned property were the only people that could vote. Okay. And African Americans were counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of the census because they were slaves. We expanded the franchise with the Jacksonian movement and all of that kind of stuff into where it was more democracy. You didn't have to own property, and it was, but again, only white men could vote. But with the Civil War, we changed all of that. Slavery was outlawed, and that was a moral triumph for the American people. Now, we didn't get rid of discrimination, and we still haven't gotten rid of discrimination in toto. But it's a whole lot better than it was when I went to public schools in the United States that were still segregated. I never attended a public school in Texas in which an African-American was one of my classmates. I didn't attend an integrated class until I went to the University of Texas. And that was in the 1960s, late 1960s. But we passed the Public Accommodations Act in 1964. We passed the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We passed the Prohibiting Discrimination in Housing in 1968. Those were monumental changes in America. And most Americans thought that was good. Not everybody, but most Americans. And by the way, back in the 1920s, we let women vote. And it took Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John Adams, and asked him in the very beginning to include what she called the ladies in the dream. But they weren't included, but they're included now. And a majority of voters in America are female. And we continue to progress in this area. We really haven't gone backwards, even though there's a lot of noise from a number of people, but they're not a majority. And I think the American experiment is ongoing because I think the American experience is about an idea. To me, America is more an idea than a place. And I still have confidence that the American people will do the right thing most of the time. And they will not solve every problem, but I think that they know in their hearts what's just and what's not. And I still have great hope that that will happen. Now, I could spend tonight, tomorrow, and all day about all the reasons why all of this is happening, but you're just going to have to take my word for it. It's going to get better.
Ambassador, you remind me of the great quote from Winston Churchill. Americans always do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other options.
Yep.
But thank you for this tour de force, to use a good French term, looking at international relations. And I was going to, in US-Japan relations, I was going to ask you about the Thucydides trap, but you sort of preempted my question there. And you seem quite optimistic that we're going to avoid the Thucydides trap. I'm sure many of you in the room understand what that means. But I have a specific question for you, challenge you just a little bit. A number of years ago, I was speaking at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and I got to spend time with former Secretary of State, Treasury, George Shultz. And I asked Secretary Shultz, I said, what do you think about our pivot to Asia? And I'll never forget his answer. He said, great idea. We pivoted to Asia and the Russians invaded Ukraine, he said. So my question is the United States stretched so thin to the breaking point that we can't continue to play the role that we have played as a global power? And do you think the US still plays a key role in maintaining the peace and the balance of power in Asia?
Yeah, without a doubt. I think American foreign policy looked at, and I think the pivot to Asia was a good thing. I think I don't think it was really what it sounded like sometimes. But to me, the United States began its foreign policy looking to Europe first. And it was kind of natural to do that because of we were a British colony. And we've continued to look to Europe first. But that can't continue because the world economy is shifting to Asia. You're going to have, I hope it's in my lifetime, I hope I live that long, but it's not too long from now. You're going to have the 5 top economies in the world, 4 of which are going to be in Asia, because you're going to have Indonesia joining the top 5. So you'll have India, you'll have Japan, you'll have India, Japan, China, Indonesia, and the United States. And I think the United States has its future in Asia, just as the future of Japan is primarily in Asia. And do we have the ability to still lead the world? Yes, if our leadership is good. If it's not good, we won't be the leader of the world. So that brings us to an interesting question. Who would take the place of the United States? Would you prefer it to be China? I don't think the American people would. I don't think the Japanese people would. So I think that's why I don't think that we're going away anytime soon, because we're still needed in the world. Now, does the international order have to be the United States directing everybody else? No, and it shouldn't be that way. But the United States can frame the argument, can frame the threats, and have an incredible influence on how the world reacts to it. But if you didn't have the United States, I really don't know how it's going to work. And all the business about a multipolar world, it doesn't have to be a bipolar world. It doesn't have to be the United States or anything, but the United States has to be at the table. And I think one of the great tragedies that has happened when we talk about the United States as a world leader, it's just not a new thing in the United States. I have been around politics my whole life, and I can remember congressional campaigns and Senate campaigns for the United States Senate, and the person that's running for the Senate says, why are we spending all this money overseas, and we need this bridge here in Fort Worth, and we could take that money in Fort Worth. Well, it's a good speech, and it's been made in every congressional district and in every state at some point in time. But the difference is when the President of the United States takes the podium and says, I understand what you're saying, but this is important to the security of the United States. The American people say, well, that sounds okay, and they go on. But we haven't had a president in a pretty long time saying that international affairs are important to the security of America, to the economy of America, to the well-being of America. We need to have that. And I'm hopeful that whoever is president in the years to come will remember that presidents are in a unique position to lead the country in this particular area, because they're the only person that stands up and speaks for the entire country at once. And I don't think I'm naive. You may think I am, but I don't think that we're too far from that speech being made again and people kind of come into their senses. I must say that the debt thing was an embarrassment, the way it dragged on. But if you noticed, I noticed the votes, and it passed the Senate today. So it's done. But I noticed that the votes came from the center out. That's where America needs to be. And there were Democrats on the left that didn't vote for it, somewhat surprisingly, frankly, to me. But there were Republicans on the right that didn't vote for it. And both of them took comfort in the fact that there were enough sane people that we weren't going to default. Okay? That's politics. That's the cynical politics that is practiced over and over today. And it doesn't do anybody any good. It may get you campaign contributions. It may get you in the news media, because what's happened is people have learned that they can say the most extreme things and get attention. And that's what they want. But that doesn't work over a long period of time. And again, I have confidence that the American people realize that. Let me just add one other thing. I think the American people are very comfortable with a right of center government or a left of center government. I think they're very uncomfortable with a left government or a right government. And I think that is coming back. And the debt vote today gives me some confidence that people are returning to the place, to the center where things can be done.
Who wants to go next? Ambassador Suzuki. Please, microphone is coming.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Schieffer. It was a great speech, very insightful and clear. I want to present myself. My bio is on page 8 in the program. So my question is, I agree with you that you have a deep insight in the dynamics of the Asia-Pacific region. And I agree with you that in Asia or Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, people would rather like to see US take the lead than China. But the reality is that we all support the US model of liberal open market economy backed by a democratic political system. And people normally should subscribe to that. But what you see in the reality is that even in Indo-Pacific or Asian world, there are countries that are ambivalent. I mean, they don't rally on our side. And it could be that the US model has lost some attraction. And you have failed in a way to convince others what is called the global South to be on our side. What is your take on this?
Well, I think it's a problem. I think we could do a better job than we might have done in the recent past. But I haven't been to Vietnam in a few years, but when I went to Vietnam, I had some very interesting meetings. And I'll tell you just the phrase that stuck out in my mind. The fellow said, you know, we had a problem with you with Americans for about 30 years. We had a problem with the Chinese for about 1,000. And we want to do more things with you. Now, I don't think the Vietnamese get up and make a lot of speeches about that, but the Vietnamese don't want the United States to leave Asia. I know that. And Mahathir never has been a great fan of the United States, okay? But I don't think Malaysia really benefits if the United States is not in the area. And you see the Philippines now making some overtures to be a part. And when Duterte was there, you just kind of worried about that. But I think that America is often criticized, but I don't have a great problem with that. I don't think Americans really have a great problem with that. I think when America is criticized by whether it's Asians or others, more often it's because they don't think we're being good Americans. They don't think that we're living up to the ideals of the country. And that's what I think about as the idea of America. So can Americans assume that everybody will understand us and assume? No, we have to do a good job. And we have to do that diplomatically. We have to do that economically. We can't pull out of the TPP and say that's a good thing. It's not a good thing. It's not but it is a thing that happens because of domestic political pressures in the United States. But they pass. And I think that we will rejoin the TPP. I think we should rejoin it. And trade is coming back. It kind of goes up and down in the United States. But I think the popularity of trade is more apparent. I come from Texas, which is, most foreigners would be surprised to know, is the largest exporter into America, into the world, far and away the largest. And so where does most of that go? Well, about 40% of it goes south to Mexico. About 20% goes to Canada. 10% had been going to China. And that has, I'm not sure, has increased. But Japan's exports to, American exports to Japan, I think, have increased. And I think they will. There is a world of opportunity out there, literally a world of opportunity. And I think if we approach it with knowledge and not ignorance, if we approach it with what we can do in the world, we'll get through this. And do we have to do a better job? We do. And there's nothing wrong with that. If we realize it and get about our business.
Amaki-san.
Hi, my name is Daiki Amaki. I'm a banker, and thank you very much for great, insightful comments. So, from a business perspective, I have a question about, ASEAN regions. What do you see the situation of each country in ASEAN countries, and what do you think make people, what do you think make people have incentives to stand by US side, for instance, protecting Taiwan side So because, you know, I stayed in Singapore for 2018 to 2021. I helped Japanese companies to invest to ASEAN regions. I found, you know, even Singapore, for instance, Singapore government-related companies like Temasek has increased many portions exposures in China. China has increasing their presence in Singapore. When I met with Indonesian business people, you know, I saw, I tried to find interesting mini hydropower plants. Some Japanese companies are interested, but many Indonesian people say they prefer Chinese people, Chinese businessmen, because you know, the Chinese investment size is very big, pretty quick decision making. In those business areas, I didn't see so many, you know, or US presence. So I personally, I don't think if, for instance, China invests Taiwan, those people in ASEAN countries don't have a strong incentive to fight for protecting Taiwan. So what do you
What do
think?
they do if they get attacked?
Sorry?
So what do they do if they get attacked?
So sorry, could you what?
You said, I thought what you said was you don't see those people coming to the aid of Taiwan, right? Or having sympathy for the conflict in Taiwan or whatever.
My point, you know, ASEAN countries, or at least people in ASEAN countries, would not fight to protect Taiwan or liberalism.
Yeah. So I'm saying, what if the tide is turned on them and China believes that maybe they should have a little different relationship with China? They wouldn't be in favor of that, would they?
You know, business perspective, if, you know, much more business relations with China, so those countries are enjoying profits from relations with China. So why they need to make a big sacrifice to fight for other countries, and, you know, and also by just seeing what is happening, even with that, they can keep their business profits. So I think, yeah, you know, politics would be different. Politics, government, I think they, each country's prime ministers would say they need to defend to protect liberalism, but they would face with domestic politics as well. And in those domestic people, you know, they wouldn't have strong, you know, incentive to support for that. I am concerned. Personally, I hope to fight for liberalism, and you know, I hope to collaborate with those ASEAN countries, but, you know, based on my own experiences, things might be different. So that's my concern. And what do you think about the situation?
Well, I think we should talk about not so much about fighting, but how we can keep from fighting. And I think that we keep from fighting wars by deterring people who would use force to change the international order. That's what we don't want to have happen. And I think democracy changes people's perspective. And I think that the stronger you can have, the more democratic states can become. And democracy takes roots to really stay a democracy. The democracy that exists in Japan today, it took a while, but it took a lot longer in the Republic of Korea to take root in Korea. But I don't think that there is the possibility now of a coup in Korea, or certainly in Japan. I think democracy works. And what we have to do is I think democracy is on the side of Japan and the United States and Korea, Republic of Korea. And I think that's been a positive thing. But you can't absent yourself in the good times and not be prepared to make some tough decisions sometimes along the way. But I think peace is possible. I have to tell you, and I talked to some of our colleagues here about this earlier. I still do not see why Russia could not have been integrated into the world economy. I think what has happened here, it's going to be a long time before Russia can be integrated into the world economy again because of their performance and because of what they're doing with their natural resources and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's a colossal strategic mistake. I don't think we have to be in war with China. If we go to war with China, we fail. Okay? We don't want to go to war, but we want to have an international order that is dependent upon the rule of law, not upon, I want your country to be in my empire. That day is over with, and it's not going to work. But you do have to try, and you have to work at it. I think trade is the salve on every wound, but you can't steal other people's intellectual property and use their intellectual property to enrich yourself. You can't flout the rule of law and then turn around and use it for your benefit. And am I saying that the United States has always been perfect? Not in any sense of the word. But I think that the United States has the model that has a better chance of establishing an international order whose foundation is peace in the world, not conquest. So.
Actually, I would like to wrap up with this question related to that question. I think my observation is Japanese are aware of the importance of Southeast Asia more than Americans. And now businesses, like Japanese businesses, both American businesses and Japanese businesses, they take a strategy called so-called China plus one. And the Japanese businesses tend to choose Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
American businesses tend to choose Mexico. So it seems like those like Mexico and Japan, US, and then Southeast Asia, these are the connected. And then global value chains of the Asia Pacific are reorganized in that line. Yeah. So I'd like to bring the politics to that picture. So how much does American politics, like Washington, notice the importance of Southeast Asia in the context of the international relations of the Asia Pacific?
Why would anybody talk about pivoting to Asia that wasn't worried about the ASEAN countries? I think what you're seeing in American policy is a refocus on Asia because that's where the growth is going to occur. That's where the big economies are going to be. That's where the big trade is going to be. As I have said earlier, I think American foreign policy used to be seen through a European lens. I think we are learning to be in other places in the world. And we don't have to be the dominant economy in the ASEAN countries. But I don't really see anybody in the ASEAN countries that thinks it's a good idea for the United States to leave Asia. Now, will they say that publicly? No, because they don't want to offend the Chinese. But if you have an Asia without America in it, you're going to have the tributary states again. They're going to have to pay, they're going to have to deal with the Middle Kingdom. And I don't think anybody wants to go to that model again. So I think this is a dynamic time, but it's a time for thoughtful responses that can have good results. And I really believe that's possible right now.
Thank you very much.